This program was made possible by a grant from S.R. Foxley, Q, and John Kilcullen, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below. Have you ever noticed the raging hard-on Christians have for ancient historians like Josephus? They just love the idea that any ancient non-Christian ever wrote down anything about Jesus at all. And I've often heard apologists proclaim in vague but decisive terms that Josephus was a super-duper reliable and respected historian, so the fact that he talked about Jesus is strong evidence for la-di-da-di-da. You get the idea. But the fact is, these references to Jesus are so quick and unsubstantial that they prove nothing. I've pointed this out in the past, but only in a quick, dismissive way. So today I thought I'd finally take a clear, direct look at what some of these writings say, how much compelling evidence they contain, and how they are used by the Christian community. I'm going to do this by reviewing a recent apologetics article that I think serves as a pretty good case study in how Christians interact with these writings. Now before we move on, I want to make sure one thing is abundantly clear, and that is that there's a world of difference between 1. Proving Christianity was a phenomenon in ancient Rome, and 2. Proving Jesus was the Son of God as portrayed in the Bible. One of these is obvious to everybody including atheists, and the other is frankly absurd. Yet many apologists seem to think that flogging the ever-loving shit out of the first point somehow helps them prove the second. It doesn't. The fact of the matter is, really weird rumors can develop over the course of decades, especially during a time of near-universal illiteracy when everything was spread by word of mouth. And if you read an ancient historian relaying the fact that Christians claim someone rose from the dead because he was a god, and your first thought is, the most likely explanation must be that he is a god who rose from the dead, then I guarantee that you're just trying to justify pre-existing belief in a religion. So as we look at these sources, keep in mind the question of which of these two facts each really proves, because apologists lean heavily on keeping this point vague. Now, a quick perusal of this article illustrates some pretty typical ways that Christians use these references within the larger context of their apologetics arguments. Notice first how much of this article is filled with biblical references. This is the most obviously pointless of apologetics exercises, in which people try to prove that events in the Bible happened by showing you Bible verses saying they happened. It's dumb and everybody knows it. So Christians think that if they sprinkle a few extra biblical references across a page full of Bible verses, it will look like they've actually provided historical documentation of something. But as I mentioned last week, these references are just decorations meant to give the illusion of credibility, while all the heavy lifting is done by the Bible. However, there's something even more damning than the amount of this essay that's made up of Bible verses, and that is which claims rely on these verses as opposed to using secular sources. The claim that's most exclusively backed up by extra biblical references is the first one, that Jesus was killed. Now, I'm not even necessarily convinced of this point, but a few historians saying a guy got executed really isn't that mind-blowing, right? Certainly nothing to base a religion around. But then look what happens as soon as we move on to any claim that even remotely indicates anything supernatural. The tomb was empty and the Jews claim someone stole the body? We have 3 Bible passages, interrupted only by a decree against digging up bodies, along with bald-faced speculation that this had anything at all to do with Jesus. Jesus rose from the dead? We get nothing but Bible verses. Jesus appeared to people after his death? All Bible verses. Basically, apologists pull a little bait-and-switch stunt where they use extra biblical sources to supposedly prove mundane things about Jesus, then run to the Bible for all the evidence of their supernatural religious claims and hope you won't notice. To show how dumb this is, imagine I was telling people I had beaten up Bruce Lee. You ask me to prove it, and I show you tons of documentary evidence that Bruce Lee existed and was a movie star and could kick people in the face like a crazy person. Then I show you a paper towel stating that I had beaten him up. Not super duper compelling, right? All I would be doing is mixing solid documentation of obvious facts with a silly assertion about a silly claim and hoping I had jumbled them together well enough that you wouldn't see where I had gone back and forth. This is precisely the tactic apologists are using and precisely how dishonest they are being. Point number 5 does this in an especially egregious and obvious way. Look at the claim it makes. Early Christians, including biblical characters, were persecuted. But other characters from the Bible just kept on trucking, implying that they had to have seen Jesus risen from the dead. Whatever limited documentation is given for these actual claims is either from the Bible or from unquoted writings that were mostly church fathers establishing additional church tradition, which is not evidence of anything other than what the church believes. That's why this article goes on to provide extra biblical support of this claim in the form of several often extensive writings from other sources. But what do these writings say? I'm not going to sit here and read them, but I'll sum them up and you can pause and read yourself if you'd like. The first talks about how Nero persecuted Christians decades after the New Testament. The second is from letters written by Pliny the Younger in 112 AD, asking about how to deal with Christians. The third is a quote from a modern source saying that Tertullian observed that people blame Christians for things and apparently wanted to feed them to lions, and the last two just talk about Christians being killed in colosseums. None of these sources say anything about Peter, Paul, Jesus, or any other character or event from the time of the Bible. Yet this article makes a claim that's peppered with Bible names, coyly using them in conjunction with a broad statement about early Christians in general, and then follows it with these totally unrelated references to other Christians and hopes you'll assume they're connected. But the difference between Bible characters being real and a body of unnamed Christians later being persecuted is so huge that anybody trying to prove one with a reference to the other is either willfully trying to deceive you or obliviously repeating things from someone else who had deceived them. But looking back to the beginning, what about those most famous references to Jesus and his death? First is this one from a text supposedly written by Josephus in 94 AD. Even granting for the sake of argument that this is legitimate, which it's probably not, what does this say, and how relevant is it? Well, it says that there was a man named Jesus who was a good guy, referring to unspecified surprising deeds and questioning whether he should be called a mere man in other translations, and reports that he gained a lot of disciples and was killed by Pilate, then notes that not only did his followers stick with him, but they claim that he rose from the dead and was possibly the Messiah. Now take a moment to soak this in. Think about what this passage says, when it says it, and where the author says he got the information. Assuming this passage isn't a simple forgery, Josephus wrote it in 94 AD, 61 years after Jesus' reported death, meaning this would probably just be a summation of decades-old word of mouth written by somebody who doesn't say anything about where he heard this, and was most likely, if not certainly, just reporting what second or third generation Christians were running around saying. For frame of reference, imagine someone today giving you a similar unsighted summary of UFO sightings that ran from 1955 to 1958. Would that mean anything to you at all? Of course not. We'd all find it laughable. Finally, this passage by Tacitus, written in 110 AD, so 77 years after Christ's reported death, or the equivalent of someone today writing about something in 1942, is almost entirely about Nero persecuting Christians and only contains one mention of Christus being punished by Pilate. So basically, this is everything wrong with the Josephus passage, except it's even less compelling, with the only reference to Jesus being a throwaway allusion used to explain who the Christians were to contextualize a more contemporary report. This is absolutely not evidence for anything about Jesus, and the fact that Christians think it is, and that they're so hungry to hear that any ancient person outside the Bible ever said anything about Jesus or Christianity, as we would fully expect them to because number one instead of number two, just shows how totally enfeebled the case for Christ is. If there were any good evidence for Jesus, Christians simply wouldn't be leaning on such desperate nonsense. And the fact that this pathetic extra-biblical support is the best Christians have and has to be sparsely scattered among Bible verses to create the illusion of respectability is just, well, sad.
What the f*** is this?